What's going on, Soul Tribe? I salute the divinity in you. Welcome to my channel, Alchemist. Justin here, and bringing another little nugget to add to the Soul Tribe archive. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Saturn in Aries in the 10th house. And this is a bit of a mixed bag for Saturn. Now, when you talk about Saturn, Saturn is the greater malefic. So Saturn does come with challenges, especially if you have a night chart. That's something that you want to pay attention to. Whereas with a day chart, Saturn still brings challenges, but it's more, you work more constructively with the more surmountable challenges with Saturn. But when you think about Saturn in a less constructive tone, Saturn deals with things of like sluggishness, laziness, depression. It could be gloom, it could be sullen. Just kind of just really brings the vibe down. Wet blanket with Saturn. But Saturn can give this feeling of like hindrances and obstacles and feeling of constraints and this sense of just like things that are long lasting and just like kind of chronic. When we're talking with Saturn, things that take time, always with Saturn. But when we're thinking constructively with Saturn, with that diligence, with that patience, Saturn is one that will, if you put in those like what they say, like 10,000 hours, then you all of a sudden, then you're like a master of your craft. And so that's something with Saturn that gives that. And Saturn can create, people of notable rank, can really create, get this decent kind of like guardianships and things like that. So yep, Saturn can really do a lot of good, but just like it just takes a lot of work with Saturn. So just something to think about there. Now, when you think about Aries, Aries is ruled by Mars, and they are the cardinal fire sign, and they're active or yang in nature. And when you think about that, Aries is just for me, this just fire, just like, and not in like necessarily an aggressive way. I think of just like even just lighting a match, that just giving life to things, that impulse to do. It's not a matter of, put it off till later. When you're feeling inspired, let's do it now. There's no better time than the present. And that's what the Aries energy gives me. It's this very inspirational one that just kind of, yeah, it gets kind of fired up, really just kind of, I think about when, plants are coming into bloom, of course, in like the northern hemisphere, plants coming into bloom and just like, yeah, just life just really kind of thriving there when we're thinking about the Aries energy. But it's just pure fire, just that active force, the will just to just do. So it's a really impressive thing when you think about Aries and having that martial influence just to drive them forward. Now, well, I'll get into that in a moment. Now, when we talk about the 10th house, this is known as just like the midheaven. And I work with whole sign houses, so there's going to be a specific point, the MC, that's going to be floating around. It could either be in the 10th house, sometimes the 11th or the ninth house, in extreme cases, the 12th or the 8th house. But some of the themes is one of the angular houses. So some of the themes that the 10th house are going to deal with is going to cover like career, advancement, reputation, any sort of like superiors, deals with like any like things that you want to achieve in life, your ambitions, anything anything you want to master, your public role in society, or like your public life in a sense. And you can even represent marriage in some instances when we think about the 10th house. So when you're working with this placement, a few things to consider. One, you would have a Cancer rising by whole sign, and you're going to want to look to Mars, is because Mars is going to be responsible for this house, and it's going to import the themes of this one and the themes of the fifth house, which deal with like children, pregnancy, pleasures, hobbies, creativity, sex, and sexuality, things like that, to whoever Mars is. And then Saturn is going to import the themes of the seventh house, dealing with relationships, marriage, partners, and other people. And then the eighth house, which deals with like death, inheritances or wills, the money of others, taxes, occult studies. All of those topics are going to be flown into this house. So another thing to think about with this one is that the reason I say this is a tricky place for Saturn is because Aries is where Saturn finds itself in its fall. So where it's in a very strong house in the 10th house, it's just in a very challenging sign. And when you think about the two, you can see why there would be that kind of dissonance with Saturn and Aries. Aries being that very active force, let's do, and then Saturn is the constraints, the no, you can't do that. So that already can show where you can see where there might already be challenges challenges in thinking about those 10th house themes, like maybe what you want to do for your career. What are your ambitions? Maybe there's some times where you can have this burst of inspiration, but then maybe sometimes if, there's like a, tough Saturn transit or something, maybe you can feel like there's this, and maybe just in general, maybe just can kind of feel like there's just something that's getting in the way. And it could be, I think, sometimes with Saturn in a fire sign is that it's not that you're not doing enough, it's maybe you're doing too much. I think that it can get this feeling of, Saturn can really get us in our heads sometimes. There's this, it's that kind of like those hidden enemies sometimes you think about with Saturn, things that are concealed from us, those things that are trying to dismantle us in a way. But I think that this is one, and this may be something where you might need to find people who can help you stay motivated. If you notice that you're one that sometimes you can, because sometimes that happens. We can get in our way sometimes. We can get tripped up, and this is something especially to pay attention to with this placement, because Saturn is, where depending on where the midheaven is, Saturn's even going to be conjunct the midheaven, or it could be squaring the ascendant. So if Saturn's, if it's hitting one of those points too, that's, and that might be something too, if you've ever wondered, well, if you've noticed that maybe this was more prominent for you than others who maybe have a similar placement, that could be definitely a huge significator of whether you're feeling these things more intensely or not. So that might be something, but finding people who I think can help motivate you. Pay attention to, I think reciprocity is a really big one. What people are offering for you and how they offer things. I would say with Saturn, sometimes there's this secrets or concealment. And I think that just happens with life. Just be mindful, use your discernment. There are going to be those of us, those who are there to support, but there may be others who have ulterior motives. And I think that's just life things. And so that's just something too I would pay attention to with this placement. Be mindful about, as far as like taking out any sort of like loans and things like that. Just like shadiness, because Saturn is one where, even though Saturn can be a bit secretive and concealment, Saturn being in such a prominent house could like expose things. So that's just something, because I could see that be another thing with Saturn dealing with long-lasting punishments, the 10th house kind of dealing with authorities. Just be mindful of that, doing things spur of the moment and not thinking about the long-term consequences with Saturn. That's something, especially with the night chart, but just in general. There's something to think about with Saturn. But, I do think, on a very constructive note, I do think that this could be someone who could potentially do very well, again, I think with time. Saturn's something that takes time, building those relationships, kind of fortifying those. You can make some really strong unions, I think, with Saturn. People who could potentially help support your career and whatever that looks like for you. That could be something with like Saturn can deal with like gardeners, people who do deal with like kind of seafaring or working by kind of like waterside trades. Saturn can deal with any kind of like government things, so anything that you can receive, this could be like private investors for a certain, like a business that you start up, for example, whatever that might look like for you. But be thinking about that. What are your ambitions? What's something that you can see yourself doing long term? And be paying attention to Saturn returns, like always, but especially with Saturn being again in such a prominent house, and especially when Saturn is the time lord of the year, because that could be where there are significant changes to your career space. And again, pay attention when you have those major kind of like Saturn aspects. Pay attention to what people come into your life around those time, how they're either helping or hindering your career. So, and again, I'd be mindful of just like how how I would share with others. This could be like just like a extreme example. Let's say you got a boss you don't like, and then you share that with someone, and then they go run their mouth, and then and then you later that week you get called into the office, and hey, I heard you don't like my work style. Like that's, pay attention to some things like that. Again, I would think that's something to be mindful of. Marriage could be something that's definitely on the table. That's something, but that may be something where maybe there's, could be like a partnership with marriage, or maybe just like the challenges in marriage may be something that might be, I don't want to say prominent, but like there just may be something that it may, again, with that 10th house, it's like a public thing. So that's just something I would be just kind of aware of there. But It's not just all just like the career and things. It could be you want to be a parent, and with Saturn too, this could be like can represent like being the parent of other people's children. So maybe you happen to get married to someone or be in a relationship with someone who already has a kid, for example. That could be maybe something that comes into the mix with Saturn. But I can see this as a really great placement too for dealing with other people's money, dealing with taxes or doing some sort of like loans or maybe something with property, something with land. Real estate's a really good thing for Saturn. But those could be something another thing that you could potentially think about. Also, too, another thing I'm thinking with just like with Saturn ruling that eighth house as well, thinking about what it is that you want to accomplish and what you do plan on leaving behind. I think that there is with this one having a long-term plan. And thinking about what that how that future is. And again, just kind of working with follow Saturn, kind of follow and see how Saturn is aspecting your natal Saturn, and that could be a good clock, just to kind of see where you're at as far as like your accomplishments and things. And it's just like, oh, okay, Saturn squaring my natal Saturn. Let's get some things that I maybe been dragging my feet a little bit. Or it's just like, okay, we get to the opposite. And it's like, you know what? I don't know if I like this. Let's change some things here. Like, okay, like that would be a great way of working with Saturn because Saturn moves slow too. By the classical planets, Saturn is the slowest. So Saturn again gives you time, and let that be something maybe to a little bit to bring a little bit of comfort. Is that we never know how much time we have, but there is, for in the present, there's always time. There's always time with Saturn. And so give yourself that time to think about really what you want and make it count. And it might be something where maybe you do start a couple of things with the cardinal energies, because it could be, the cardinals are great initiators. But again, if you don't have maybe like any sort of like a lot of fixed placement of things, it's just sustaining stuff could be difficult for you. So that would be something that I would just kind of analyze in oneself and just kind of adjusting kind. But yes, that's a lot with that placement. That's just a rough idea of some things that I would talk about with someone with this placement. You definitely need the whole chart to get an idea of how this may be showing up for you. And I would love to hear if you have this placement or know someone who's working with this placement down in the comment section. Let us know how this has shown up if you feel comfortable doing that. And I think that it's always neat to be able to compare notes like that and see how we're all kind of figuring out these energies together. And if that's something where if you want to work, you get to know your natal chart more personally, or if you want to follow to see maybe if you're in a Saturn year, follow any sort of like see what kind of transits are more active for you, or if you want to do any sort of like elections, whether that be from maybe starting up a business to signing a contract, or maybe this is buying a house, a car, whatever that might be looking like for you. Down in the description box is a link to book a consultation with me, so definitely check that out. And if you have any questions about the services that I provide, my email's down there as well, so feel free to reach out with any questions. And there's also a couple of links down there that's for some playlists. One's going to be for Celestial News Monthly, which I need to change that. But it's where it talks about where the sun and the other classical planets are at, what signs are transiting, what zodiac signs are going to be most affected, and how to most practically work with those energies. And then the other one is the lunar shenanigans. That's a monthly one. And then the other one is the lunar shenanigans. And I took over that one. That was a weekly one. And it talks about the astrology of the moon, what sign it's in, what phase it's in, when it happens to be going void of course, and just to get a feel of the week as the moon is forming different aspects with the different celestial bodies and distributing those energies to us. So just some things to check out there for you. But until next time, stay mindful out there. Keep raising that vibration through the roof. And I will catch you on the next one. Later.